Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave, and today we're going to build a Node.js relay to hide our API keys. You cannot hide code in the browser. There's no way to hide the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that we use in the browser. We can inspect the code and see all of it, and that's great, except when we need to hide something like an API key. And therefore, we need to hide our API keys in code that executes outside of the browser, and that puts it on the back end. Our node relay is actually an API in and of itself. It will wait for our requests and then relay those requests to the data API that we need data from. Likewise, our node relay will listen for those responses, and then it will send those responses back to us. And so, much like the title suggests, it actually relays information in both directions. By doing so, this keeps our API keys out of our front-end code, but it still allows us to request the information we need. I'm also going to show you how to protect the API endpoints we create so only your applications can use them. And before we finish, I'll show you how to launch this code from my GitHub repository, and you'll be able to host it for free. You'll also be able to modify it and make it your own. So let's get started. We'll get started by going to nodejs.org and download the latest edition of Node. It should have Windows if you're on Windows, or there are other downloads if it does not identify what system you're on. When you install Node.js, you will also be installing npm, which is Node Package Manager, and there is a large repository of different libraries that you can use with npm. When I say libraries, I mean packages. Search packages right here, and you can find many things, and we'll use several today. I now have Visual Studio Code open and have created an empty folder, and we need to open a terminal window or a command line interface. You can do that by going to the View menu and choosing Terminal. And as you'll note, you can also do it by pressing Control plus the backtick key. So that's what I will do. And notice my terminal window opens up, and I'm using bash, as it will indicate here. You could use other command line interfaces as well, but I use bash, and that's what I always use with Git. If you do not have bash installed, by installing Git, you will get the bash command line or bash terminal installed also. And I have a video about GitHub basics and Git basics, and it will walk you through that as well. So I should show that up in the top right, probably right now. Now that we have node and npm installed, let's verify just by typing node-v, and it shows the latest version, or at least the version that I have installed. You may have a newer version now as you follow this tutorial. We can do the same with npm-v and see what version of that we have. And now that we've confirmed we have node and npm installed correctly, we need to initialize npm much like we would initialize a Git repository. So I'm going to type npm init and then -y. And what the -y flag does is helps us skip over all the questions it would ask if we didn't put -y. It will generate a package.json file. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter. And instead of asking me questions about what to put in the file, it just goes ahead and generates it. So now I'll scroll that down. We can look at the package.json. You can see the name is the name of the folder. I have key relay tut, version, no description. The main file will be index.js. We have a place for our scripts, and they put in a test script, keywords, author, and license. We don't really need to add anything else to that right now, but some things will be added automatically as we add some dependencies with npm to our project. To add dependencies, at the command line, we'll type npm and then I, which is a shortcut for the word install. And now we can type the dependencies we need. So I'm going to type .env. And many times that's all you would do if you just wanted one package added. But we can add spaces and continue to add packages here. So I also want Express, which is a framework that is often used with Node. And I want cores. Now I'll press enter. And npm will install all of these packages. Now let's take another look at our package index.json file, and we can see we now have a dependencies section that has cores.env and express. Now I also have a dev dependency that we will also use, but only during the dev portion of the project, so in the dev environment. So here I want to type npm I and then nodemon, and then I'm going to type -d, and that is a shortcut for saying --save-dev, if you see that. So I'm installing the package and then only saving it to the dev dependencies. Once this installs, we'll check our package JSON again. And now that we've installed nodemon, we see here under our dev dependencies in our package JSON file. There's one more package I forgot, and that is node fetch. So let's go ahead and type npm one more time with I, and this will be for our production, not just dev. So we'll have node-fetch, and we'll go ahead and add that package as well. As fetch is found in vanilla JavaScript, is not in Node by default. And now we have node fetch up here in our package.json as well. Now let's change our scripts. We'll get rid of the test script and we'll add a start script that starts with node, and then we name our file index.js. And then we'll add a dev script, and with that, instead of node, we'll use nodemon. And nodemon is great because every time we make a change and save it, it relaunches our application without us having to do it manually. With our dependencies installed, now we can see the main file is supposed to be index.js. So let's go to the file tree and create index.js. And now inside the index.js, we need to pull in the dependencies. So we'll start with require, and we'll require the .env package, and it needs the config method called. We'll define express, and this is the express framework that we'll require. Then we'll define cores, and we'll require that as well. And after cores, we'll define app, and app will equal express being called into action. We'll define the port that we'll listen on. We'll make that port 3000. And now we can actually start using a feature of express. That's app.use, and now we'll say express.json, and this will enable the JSON middleware on every route that we create for our API. We also want to use cores. And here we'll call cores without any options, but later on we'll pass some options into cores as well. And now we can create our test route. So I'll just put a little note here that this is a test route. Say app.get. This will be for GET requests, just like we would do directly from the browser. We'll have an anonymous function here, and it starts with a request parameter and then a response parameter. And now we'll respond with JSON, and I'll just say success, and then hello world to end it out. And now we have a test route already in our API, and now we just need to listen on our port. So we'll put app.listen, pass in the port we defined, another anonymous function. Here we'll log to the console, and we'll say app listening on port, and we'll pass in the port value. And we should be ready to test out our test route for the application already. We'll go back to package.json, and we can see our dev environment will run with the dev script. So we'll type npm run dev. And we have app listening on port 3000. Now let's go to the browser and test it out. We have a blank page here, so I'm going to type in localhost, and then add colon port 3000 and the slash, and we get success, hello world. Now let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and we're going to create a subdirectory. So I'll create a new folder. I'm going to name this weather because I want to use this relay to use data from the OpenWeather API. So here is the weather subdirectory. Now in the weather subdirectory, I'll create another index.js, as it will be the default file for this subdirectory. Now at the top of this file, I'm going to once again define express, require that. And then I'm going to define router. That's going to equal express.router with a capital R. And then I'm going to define fetch. And that is going to equal the node-fetch, because we'll need to be using fetch in this file. Now let's first start by setting another default route to test. So we'll use router.get. This will be a GET request once again. There's our slash, an anonymous function with request and response parameters, an arrow function, and then we'll respond with JSON once again. And here we'll do the same thing, but I'll say success, and then we'll say hello weather. And that way we'll know we're following this route. But what else could we do here so we know we're using this route? Well, we have to export it. So we'll say module.exports equals router. We'll save that much. Now let's go back to the default index.js for the entire project, not just the weather subdirectory. And we can add the weather route. Under the port definition, I'll go down an extra line. I'm going to define weather, have that equal require, and now I'm going to point to the weather folder. And so the index.js from the weather folder will launch by default with the weather folder. And then under our test route, I'm going to add our weather route, and it will be app.use, and then we'll have /weather, a comma, and then we'll pass in weather that we just defined up here. We're once again listening on port 3000, and NodeMon restarted after our changes. So let's go to the browser, and now instead of just localhost 3000, we'll say /weather. And we've got our success, hello weather. Now let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And inside Visual Studio Code, we need to create a .env file. So I'm going to just add another file. Oh, I don't want that in the weather folder actually. So I'll minimize that. I'll select the index here so I know I'm in the right directory. And now I'll create .env. Now .env should never be included in your GitHub repository, but I will share how to use this .env later on when it's not in your local environment. Right now, let's just create this file, and it's going to hold a secret. And for me, although this could hold more than one API key or any secret, I'm going to put in my weather API key from openweathermap.com, and of course I will change it after this tutorial, so I'm not worried about sharing it with you right now. And this is the total content for this .env file. And once again, we do not want to put it into GitHub. So to prevent that from happening, we'll create one more file that starts with dot, and then we'll type gitignore. And if you make this project into a GitHub repository or a Git repository that you would push to GitHub, by adding the .env to your gitignore file, it will ensure that it does not add it to the repository or push it to GitHub. Now let's go back to the weather index file in that weather subdirectory. And the first thing I want to do is add a function so we can keep our code dry. I'm not repeating the function in each route. So we'll say const fetch weather, and we'll make this an async function. and it will receive our search text parameter. It's an arrow function, and now we'll define a URL. And I'm going to paste in this URL from the Open Weather Map API, and it will be a template literal string, and then I'm going to use Alt-Z in Visual Studio Code to wrap it so we can fit it all on the same screen. And here you see the URL, and then we're taking our search text parameter and inserting it into this URL string. And then we're also taking this process.env.weather API key, and that is how you pull data, any constant you define in the .env file, into your code. So you start with process, then .env, and then .weather API key, or whatever you have named your constant. So let's go ahead and finish that line off, and now we'll start a try block. And in this try block, I'm going to define the weather stream. This would be a data stream we receive, and I will await, and we can use fetch because we required the node fetch package. And I'm going to pass in the URL. Now once we receive that, I'm going to define weather JSON, and we'll await and then take the weather stream and apply the JSON method to it. And then we'll just return the weather JSON that we have. But then we also need a catch in case there's an error. And we want our API to also return any errors back to us as well. So here we'll just start with error, and then I'll put in the error stack. And this function will either return the weather JSON we expect, or it will return whatever error it receives from the Open Weather API. So now that we've defined our fetch weather function, we can define our routes below. Let's start with a GET request route, and I'll put it right under our default route. And now we'll say router.get, and we'll have a slash, and then we'll put our parameter, which is search text. And then this will be an async function with a request and a response. And now inside the function, we can define the search text first. And that will need to be set equal to request.params.searchText. Now this is unique to a GET request, and we'll see it is different when you do a POST request. But a GET request has params, or could possibly have params, which are parameters. And from there, I'm going to define data, and this is what we'll get back from our function. And it is an async function, so we will await its completion. So we have fetch weather, and we pass in our search text parameter. And now that we have the data, we can just send a response in JSON back to our application, and that will be the data, whether it's the weather data or the error data. Either way, we want to receive whatever the API sent back to us. And our relay API is essentially a middleman that is requesting the data, receiving it, and then sending it back to us after we make the initial request. So there is the GET route. Now let's add a POST route as well. Almost spelled post like toast, but it's just P-O-S-T. There we go. And now it just goes to the root route. You do not put a parameter in the URL of a POST request because it has a body instead. We'll have, once again, async function with a request and a response. Inside the body of this function, we once again need to define that search text. But here, as I mentioned before, it's different. Instead of params, it has a body. And then we'll look for the search text inside of it. And from there, this will look the same. So our function did make our code dry, except we do have to have a couple of lines that are the same. And here we'll call the fetch weather function. We'll pass in our search text. And then once again, we'll respond with JSON back to our application that has requested the data in the first place, and it responds with either the weather data we expected or an error if provided by the API. We've already got our GET request to the weather route, so let's go ahead and pass in a city name, and I'm going to pass in Wichita. And there is the data received that quickly through our node relay from the Open Weather Map API and back into our browser. The browser by default will use a GET request. But what I like to use to test post requests and often just test APIs in general is the Postman application. So we can go to postman.com/downloads and you can download Postman. And it actually says there is a new web version of Postman as well. I have not tried that yet, but you could possibly do that. I believe I'm using the desktop version. And so what I'm going to do is open that up real quick. This is my desktop version of Postman. I'm going to click the plus symbol up here to open a new tab. I've got an untitled request, and you can see it's supposed to be a GET request. It says enter request URL. And I'm just going to paste in our basic route, and we should get a hello world message with a success. And that is exactly what we get down here. And so now we can test our weather route. I'll put /weather, and this will also be a GET request. And yes, it says hello weather. Now, if you remember how we structured our API to expect a parameter, it expects it right after a slash after the weather. So weather slash, and for example, Wichita. Traditionally in GET request, you might see parameters more like Postman wants to do it. And here I could put search text and then tab over and put Topeka. And notice our URL, Postman changed it to add a question mark, search text equals Topeka. That is not how we structured our API. So that won't work for us. What we need to do is put a slash and then say Wichita, and I'll tab over or click send, either way. And now we get the weather for Wichita. So our GET requests are all working. That's good. Now let's switch to the post request. And if you remember, post is a little different. We don't need to put a parameter in the URL. That's not how post works. So we just have weather and then the slash, or we could even remove the slash and it will be fine. What we do need to do is add a header. And a header here that we need to add is content-type, and then we'll tab over and put application/JSON. Now that we've added our content type header, we can go and add the body, and we'll click raw, so we can just type in the raw JSON. And here we'll put search text. And now let's put in a city name, and I'll put Topeka. Okay, now we'll click send. And yes, our route with using the post request instead of a GET request also works, and we now have the weather for Topeka. Now that we've tested the routes in our development environment, we're almost ready to take our relay live. But there are a couple of things we should go back to Visual Studio Code and add before we do that. In the terminal window below, I'm going to press Control-C to stop, and now I'm going to add another package. Type npm I and then express-rate-limit. And with this package added, we can go back to the top of our installation, and just somewhere here I'm going to type under express, and I'll define rate limit and set it equal to require, and then express rate limit, there it is. And we'll save that, and then we'll set a rate limit for our API. Above the test route, I'm going to type const and define a limiter and set that equal to a rate limit. And now we'll have an object here, and inside our object, I'm going to type window ms and set that equal to 1000, which is really 1 second because these are milliseconds. And then on the next line, we'll set max of 1. And what this does is this defines 1 second, and the second line says how often, or limit each IP to 1 request per second, in other words. So we're limited to 1 request per whatever this number above is. Now we still need to apply this to the routes. So right after that, we can type app node.use and pass in the limiter we have defined. And now that applies to all routes. A second and more important option is actually applying some security to your routes. And that is because we've gone to all of this trouble to hide the API key, but inside of your front-end app in the browser, your route is still viewable. And so now all someone would have to do is copy your route, not even worry about the key, and they could use your route without needing anything else. So we need to secure that route, and so you might not consider this optional at all. Above where we apply cores to all the routes, we're going to define a whitelist. And this whitelist will be the URLs that we will permit to access our routes. And while we're in development, it's a good idea to add the local host address, or which would also be 127.0.0.1. And if you're developing an app, say inside of Visual Studio Code, you might not only have this address, but say you're using the live server extension, you might have a port number of 5500 or 5501, something like that at the end as well. These would be whitelisted addresses during development. Now, when your development was complete, you would want to remove these addresses and actually put in the URL of where your application is hosted. Say you hosted it on Netlify or somewhere else, and they give you an assigned URL. That's what you would want to put in here. But there we've defined our whitelist. Now let's define our cores options. And we're going to set this equal to an object. And inside this object, we have an origin that calls a function. And here we'll have origin and a callback function passed in as parameters, and this is an arrow function. Now we can say if, and here we'll put if there's no origin, and this is what will allow tools such as the Postman tool to go ahead and access these routes as we test them. Otherwise, Postman would not work because it will not have an origin. But then we'll also say or, and now we'll look at the whitelist we defined, and we'll call the index of method. We'll pass in the origin. Now if the index of is not equal to -1, then we'll call the callback. That means if it found it. And then the first parameter in the callback is usually what an error is, and we'll say that is null, no error. And the second is the response, and we can just put true. So it goes ahead, and yes, those routes are now accessible. Else, we'll call this callback, and now we'll have an error. Create a new error, and we'll say not allowed by cores. But we also need to add a comma right after that if statement, and we'll also have an options, whoops, no caps please, options now success status, and we'll give it a 200. 200 means success. And now we're still not using our cores options. So when we call cores, we need to pass in the options right there. And now these options will be used on all routes. So essentially every route will be checked against our whitelist, and only applications or requests, I should say, requests coming from our whitelists will be allowed to use our routes. Now that we've protected our routes, we want to add everything to a Git repository and push it to GitHub. But before we do that, in the gitignore file, it's very important that we add the node modules folder to that. If we don't, this is a huge folder that has lots and lots of packages that we do not need to add to our repository, but they will be added if you don't add node_modules to your gitignore file. All right, I created the Git repository and pushed it to GitHub. You can find it on my GitHub account at gitignore/node_API-key-relay. And as you'll see, I added a README file, that has a remix button. And if we just click this remix button, it will launch this project for you to remix the way you want to on Glitch. And if you don't have an account on Glitch, they are free. So sign up for an account and it will save your project. I'm going to click this now. And Glitch is importing directly from GitHub to a new project on glitch.com. It takes just a minute, but you should eventually see import successful pop up. And now you see the README and everything that I had in my repository on GitHub is now here in Glitch. But notice Glitch provides a .env file because we did not push the .env file to GitHub. So you can now set up your secrets in the .env here on Glitch. And they have an add a variable button, so it works just a little bit differently than typing directly into a file. I'm going to click the button. And when it says add a variable name, I'll once again add my weather API key. It's important that these names match what you have in your code. And now the variable value, I'll paste in my API key for the openweathermap.org. And that should be good to go. Let's take a look at the index.js. And we can see all of our code here. It doesn't look like Visual Studio Code, but it is the same code. Now let's click the Show button at the top where it says you can preview your app. And let's just choose Next to the code. And because the browser issues a GET request automatically to the root, we see our test route that says Success, Hello World. Let's click the Change URL button. And now we can see the actual URL of our application that's live on the web on Glitch. And we'll just copy this, and then we can take it to Postman and test our routes. So instead of localhost 3000 weather, we can paste in this new URL that ends in glitch.me and have /weather. And let's just go ahead and test the post route that we have in here. And once again, we received the weather for Topeka. Now let's change to the GET request, but it's important that we remember how the GET request is formed. It won't use any body, so we'll click None on the Body tab. And instead of the params here, we need to remember that we use weather and then we put the name of the city we want afterwards. So we could put Omaha right after weather. We don't want search text equals Omaha or anything like that. So now let's go ahead and click Send. And it took just a second to hear back from the API, but now we have the weather from Omaha as well, and our GET and POST request routes are working. Real quick, let's go back to GitHub. And I just want to emphasize that if you go to my public repository for the Node API key relay, you can click this Remix on Glitch button, launch the project from this repository on Glitch and modify it and hide your own API keys and use this project as a relay. In this tutorial, I created a weather subroute for the weather API. You could create as many subroutes as you want to for many different APIs that you want to use. So you could essentially use this one node relay as the backend relay for many different APIs and use it in many different projects. I'll be sharing more about Node.js and Express and creating some simple APIs. And until then, the videos on the left may help you on your coding journey. Thank you so much for watching and subscribing, and I'll see you next time.